Hey guys, it's Marco from the MRM channel, back with another video, and today I'll be reviewing Nosferatu, the new horror film written and directed by Robert Eggers, starring Nicholas Hoult, Bill Skarsgård, Lily Rose Depp, Aaron Taylor-Johnson, and Willem Dafoe. Before we do get into the review though, there are just a few things I wanted to get out of the way first. As always, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below if you have seen Nosferatu yourself, and whether you enjoyed the film or not. I'd love to have a friendly discussion down there. Secondly, this review will contain spoilers for Nosferatu, so if you haven't seen the film but don't care for spoilers, then continue watching as normal. Finally, I want to thank you guys for the support you've been showing towards the channel, as well as the Instagram page. I'm so glad that you guys are loving the content that I'm uploading and are engaging with it post the relaunch. With that all out of the way, it's time we get into the Nosferatu review, kicking off with a plot recap / analysis. So Nosferatu follows real estate agent Thomas Hutter as he journeys to Transylvania to have a fateful meeting with Count Orlok and to conclude a deal about a new property that the Count is interested in. While sealing this deal, Hutter's wife Ellen Sue begins to experience nightmares and a sense of dread as a dark force begins to overshadow the city and ultimately come for Ellen herself. Something I found interesting about Eggers' interpretation of Nosferatu and the Dracula mythos is that he keeps a lot of the mythos intact throughout the film, but also changes things that are not exactly present in the original novel. And of course, there are many interpretations of Dracula, and various interpretations take Bram Stoker's original novel and make it their own, such as the 30s version with Bela Lugosi and Francis Ford Coppola's version. However, Eggers' version is meant to also be an adaptation of the 1920s silent film of the same name. So there are definitely elements in Eggers' version that are taken from both Bram Stoker's novel as well as the 1920s silent film. As for some of the things that are kind of stay the same in terms of the plot, I did notice that a lot of the characters and their roles are very much the same. Nicholas Hoult's character, Thomas Hutter, still plays a real estate agent who journeys to Transylvania to seal the property deal with Count Orlok, and during his stay at Transylvania, he soon becomes influenced by Orlok and ultimately falls under attack to Orlok's attacks and all that type of stuff as well. However, the difference is that Hoult's character isn't known as traditionally, whether it be in the Coppola version or whether it be in the Lugosi version or in the book, traditionally it's either Matthew Renfield or Jonathan Harker that journey to Transylvania to seal the deal. However, this time around, Hoult's character, his name is Thomas Hutter. Fun fact as well, Nicholas Hoult a few years ago actually starred in a film called Renfield, where he played Dracula's assistant, played by Nicolas Cage, and in that film he actually had to bring Dracula back to his full strength. So I don't know if that was maybe a bit of a coincidence, but I did find it a bit funny that Hoult had played a different version of the character he was playing in Nosferatu. On top of that as well, Lily Rose Depp, who plays Ellen Hutton, Thomas Hutton's wife, her role throughout the film is also very similar to Mina Harker's role in Coppola's version of Dracula, and even other versions of Dracula as well. I haven't exactly read Bram Stoker's novel in full, but I feel like there is some elements there as well. Regardless, so her name has been changed as well, but her story arc is pretty much the same, with her falling prey to Count Orlok's seduction, and eventually falling for him, even though trying to resist him initially as well. For those of you who have watched Francis Ford Coppola's version of Bram Stoker's Dracula, you probably would remember that Winona Ryder's character, Mina Harker, falls prey to Count Dracula's seduction, ends up falling in love with him, and ultimately gives her life to Count Dracula. So I did notice that Eggers did kind of keep that kind of trend of, the love interest falling in love with the vampire in a sense. A lot of other characters, such as Willem Dafoe's character and Aaron Taylor-Johnson's character as well, also felt very much like homages to previous iterations of Dracula media, once again Coppola's and the Bela Lugosi version. Willem Dafoe's character very much felt like the Abraham Van Helsing of the film, as Hoult and Aaron Taylor-Johnson's character do seek out his character throughout the film as to provide assistance to take down Count Orlok, very much akin to Anthony Hopkins in Coppola's version of Bram Stoker's Dracula. However, this time around, Willem Dafoe's Van Helsing character, his name isn't actually Abraham Van Helsing. It's a lot different compared to the original source material, but this time around, his character wasn't portrayed as sort of this very calm, mild-mannered sort of, doctor who was very confident in his methods. He seemed more like a lunatic of sorts. That's not to say he was initially a bad character, or he was, I guess, he didn't really serve the story, and I will get more into his character when we get to the casting character breakdown. But in terms of his story arc, it had the Abraham Van Helsing story arc, but it didn't have sort of, the same depth as Anthony Hopkins' version in Coppola's version. As for Aaron Taylor-Johnson's character, I more attribute him to sort of the other, I guess, rich individuals that appear in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Those that kind of band together to take down Dracula after he, you know, seduces Mina Harker and all that type of stuff, you know. So I definitely attributed his character, but the way his arc ended, you know, I thought was actually quite surprising, considering that initially he wants to help, you know, Willem Dafoe's character and this other doctor played by Ralph Ineson. They want to help stop this plague, stop Count Orlok's reign, but eventually, because Aaron Taylor-Johnson's his character, his wife and children die because of Orlok, he decides to essentially not necessarily kill himself, but he's so overstruck by grief that he can't actually continue with the mission. So I found his arc quite surprising and definitely very different compared to previous iterations of Dracula and his story as well. Something else I also noticed with Robert Eggers' sort of interpretation of Dracula is also Count Orlok's influence over, you know, the town that he visits. I mean, in this case, it's meant to be Germany set in the 1830s, whereas previous iterations he visits England and purchases a property called Carfax Abbey, but this time around he actually goes to Germany instead, which I think definitely worked. I think the setting definitely worked this time around. But something I did notice differently is that traditionally Dracula begins to sort of infect different people to, I guess, you know, fuel himself, you know, restore his strength and all that sort of stuff, you know. But also another element is the idea of a plague, because generally the vampire sort of, I guess, disease is generally portrayed as like a plague of sorts, you know, that Van Helsing, you know, Harker, Homewood, you know, all those characters in the original novel try to stop by destroying the vampire, even present in Bela Lugosi's version from the 1930s, where Van Helsing tells Harker that they must destroy the vampire to, I guess, end the disease and all that type of stuff. But this time around, Orlok only really doesn't actually really infect that many people. He does attack Nicholas Holt's character while he's visiting him in Transylvania, but even then he doesn't completely infect him. He more just uses him as sort of like a recharge point, in a sense, as a way to restore his strength, so he can travel to Germany to visit this property, but ultimately track down Ellen as well. And on top of that as well, the only other person that he actually sort of manipulates and bends to his will is Thomas Hutter's superior, who works at the real estate agency that Thomas Hutter works at. And his character was very much meant to be sort of the Renfield, Jonathan Harker-esque kind of character, except I like the fact that they switched it up, where initially you might think it's Nicholas Holt who will fall prey to Count Orlok's will and all these demands and all that sort of stuff, but in the end it's actually a puppet that he already had control of, you know, right at the beginning of the movie. Pretty much it's revealed that he actually had control of this real estate agent, like way before, like, you know, Holt's character even meets Count Orlok and all that type of stuff, you know. So I kind of like that twist and that kind of change in character as well. But something else I also noticed is, well, talking about, you know, Count Orlok infecting people and all that sort of stuff, what happens is the film decides to take a more psychological approach and a more sort of realistic approach when talking about, you know, Orlok's control over people. And what they do is instead is Orlok actually sends a ship filled with plague rats, and these plague rats actually begin to infect the town that Thomas Hutter and his wife live in, ultimately beginning to kill people. And I guess you could say it's a metaphor for Orlok's control over people, how he's able to infect people. But the difference is this time around, he's actually not going out there to, suck on their blood and turn them into vampires and all that sort of stuff. So I actually found that a bit interesting, that ultimately the downfall of this town in Germany actually wasn't because of Orlok. I mean, it was in part of Orlok, but because of plague rats. So I really like that twist, and that it wasn't Dracula, you know, sucking people and changing them all together. Speaking of Count Orlok, his story was changed greatly as well compared to the source material. I mean, a lot of it still stuck to the original source material. The fact that, you know, Orlok, he's buying a property in some, you know, European country. Well, he is based in Europe in Transylvania, but, you know, he's buying it in like England or Germany or something like that. You know, there's still that, and how he's able to coerce, you know, the real estate agent that comes to visit him. There is still that, but as I said, the difference between him and previous iterations is that Orlok actually didn't really attack that many people. I mean, he did visit people every now and again. You know, he set like a deadline for Lily Rose Depp's character, Ellen Hutton as well. You know, and so in a way, Orlok was more portrayed as this overshadowing threat rather than, you know, the traditional vampire, you know, sucking blood from people, building an army of sorts. I mean, that has happened in other vampire films that maybe haven't adapted Bram Stoker's Dracula. But I really like the fact that Count Orlok this time around was more of a psychological threat, and, you know, more of a threat from the darkness rather than, you know, this physical threat that they had to take out. I mean, he was ultimately a physical threat, but compared to previous iterations, like, once again, with Coppola's version, Gary Oldman's interpretation of Dracula and the character and all that sort of stuff, he actually felt like a physical threat because he was a shapeshifter of sorts. You know, he could transform into a werewolf, he could transform into, like, you know, a group of rats, all that type of stuff, a bat, all that type of stuff, you know? Whereas in this one, he was just this withered, decrepit old man, and so he had to kind of, you know, extend his influence, you know, he had that real estate agent under his control, you know, he sent the plague rats, all that type of stuff, you know. So I guess ultimately what I'm trying to say is I kind of like the different interpretation that Robert Eggers brought to Nosferatu, and even the fact that, you know, Dracula is named Count Orlok. I was speaking to someone that I went to see the movie about, and he had told me that Orlok and Dracula are technically the same person, but it's just, I think Nosferatu is maybe perhaps the German translation. Don't quote me on that, but I feel like, you know, Count Orlok and, you know, Nosferatu and all that sort of stuff is meant to be sort of a different interpretation of Count Dracula, you know, perhaps a different culture has interpreted it that way. But regardless, I really like the storytelling that Eggers did with the film. I like the fact that it isn't exactly a full-blown horror movie. There are a couple of jump scares in the film, but for the majority, it is meant to be a psychological kind of horror film in a sense. You know, Orlok is spreading his influence, not physically, but mentally. And to see, you know, the fact that Ellen's mental state kind of deteriorates later on, she soon falls prey to Orlok's seduction. You know, initially Nicholas Holt's character was a bit kind of on the fence about Orlok, and then eventually kind of falls to his prey, but ultimately fear drives him to escape. Essentially, even Aaron Taylor Johnson's character and even Willem Dafoe's character to an extent kind of fall prey to Orlok's influence. So I kind of like the fact that Orlok physically didn't pose a threat, but he was able to play into their emotions and the relationships and all that sort of stuff. So I think that definitely did well and served the story really, really well. But regardless, with the plot analysis out of the way, I think it's time we move on to the cast/character breakdown. So the cast of Nosferatu, I must admit, did an absolutely great job. If there was one thing I definitely loved about Nosferatu was the performances from all the actors. The story was pretty good, and as I said, it was a pretty good interpretation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but I do feel at times it was a little bit slow, and the pacing could have been a little bit quicker in my opinion. But however, I do think the performances definitely carry the story that Eggers was trying to tell. Nicholas Hoult, I think, was great as Thomas Hutton. I really love the fact that when we first introduced to him, he just seems like a mild-mannered, you know, a husband. You know, he's just trying to do the best for his wife, all that type of stuff. The whole reason he does this deal with Count Orlok is to, you know, get a better life for him and his wife. But then once he visits Orlok, you can tell he just changes so much. The fact that, you know, he becomes so afraid, so fearful, you know, he's trying to escape, but he can't, you know. And I think Nicholas Hoult does an absolutely superb job as Thomas Hutton. And I think later on, even when he returns back to Germany, to his wife, you can still see that he's not the same confident man that we saw at the start of the film. You know, his mental state has deteriorated being around Count Orlok. Lily Rose Depp was also another surprising performance. I thought she did an absolutely phenomenal job as Ellen Hutton. The stuff she was able to do, you know, sometimes she would have a seizure because of, you know, I guess this connection she had to Orlok, you know, the physicality she brought into the performance, I thought was really, really good. There were some times where I felt she was kind of overacting a bit too much. There were times where I felt like, you know, she was putting a bit too much, you know, the whole possession thing, connection to Orlok, all of that. But I think she had a really, really strong performance, and there were definitely times where I found her character unpredictable. Like at one point when they're talking to Willem Dafoe's character, she walks Willem Dafoe's character back to his lab, his house of sorts, and I guess they discuss about how they need to destroy Orlok, and Willem Dafoe's character reveals that ultimately they can't really destroy Orlok physically, they have to destroy him emotionally. And the shot where you see kind of Lily Rose Depp looking solemnly at Willem Dafoe's character, you can almost imply that she knows she has to sacrifice herself to destroy Orlok in a sense. So I really thought her performance was great. I think a little hammed up at times, I think just a little bit of overacting, but otherwise really liked her performance for the most part. Of course, so I think for me, the best performance in the whole movie actually had to come from Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok. I mean, Nicholas Hoult was great and Lily Rose Depp were great as well, but Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok was just absolutely phenomenal. And of course, I do want to like congratulate the makeup team and the prosthetic team and all that sort of stuff. I am going to get into that a bit later with my final thoughts / the miscellaneous notes. But Bill Skarsgård, his physicality in terms of, you know, his performance as Count Orlok was absolutely incredible. I really love the fact that besides his voice, I could barely recognize him. You know, even with the makeup, I could barely recognize Bill Skarsgård, but you can tell he's an actor that is familiar with, you know, prosthetics, you know, changing his voice, his performance, you know. For those of you who may know, he did play Pennywise in the It reboot directed by Andy Muschietti, but he was just absolutely incredible. The fact he was able to transform himself so much and just make himself such an imposing presence. I mean, watching him as Count Orlok, and once again, the makeup and prosthetics, you know, factor into this, but just seeing him, I did not recognize him at any point. I thought he was this completely different actor. But then after a while, I could start to see Bill Skarsgård beneath, you know, all the scars, the, you know, raky flesh, all that type of stuff, you know. But his performance was absolutely phenomenal. And I love the choice from Robert Eggers of having Bill Skarsgård both communicate to characters in English, but also in Count Orlok's native tongue. You know, I thought that was a really great choice, as it kind of, you know, created this sense of mystery, created this sense of, you know, I guess a threat in a sense. I don't know. For me, I just kind of like the parallel that, you know, sometimes he would talk in his native tongue, sometimes he would talk in, you know, in English. And I think the times where he was talking in his native tongue, I think that's when his power was at his best. You know, that's when he had the most influence over the characters. So, you know, I think Bill Skarsgård was just definitely the top performance for me. You know, the other actors were great, definitely, but I definitely think Bill Skarsgård was the best. I think the writing for Count Orlok was absolutely phenomenal. As for the other characters, I thought Willem Dafoe's character was pretty good. Willem Dafoe is just great in pretty much anything. Even if it's bad, I feel like he's pretty good in anything. And I thought his role as the Van Helsing kind of character was pretty good for the most part. I do admit, though, that I was a bit kind of let down in a sense when later on, when they go to infiltrate Orlok's property in Germany, they find his coffin, and then, you know, they stab the real estate agent who's actually masquerading as Orlok. You know, later on, then we kind of see that he was actually, that Defoe's character isn't really this sort of, you know, I guess sophisticated individual like Hopkins' version and Coppola's interpretation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. He's more of like this sort of crazy, wild-eyed scientist. But to be fair, they do kind of mention that he's a man who deals with kind of black magic and, you know, archaic things and all that type of stuff, you know. But I think Willem Dafoe definitely did a great job. You know, he was giving 110%. There were times where he would just be able to command the scene as well, you know, like just out of the blue, he would just kind of like take control of the scene, and I was just like, okay, yeah, this character's actually pretty good. But then there were times where I'm like, ooh, he's a bit too wacky in my opinion, you know. But I think for the most part, Willem Dafoe just did what what he was given in the script. I think he did a pretty good job for the most part. Finally, for the final two characters I just wanted to talk about, Aaron Taylor-Johnson's role, I feel like he did a great job of just playing this sort of rich man who thought he had the, you know, the perfect life, you know, loving wife, loving child, all that type of stuff, you know. And I like the fact that later on his mental state begins to deteriorate as the plague begins to set into Germany, you know, and I think he does a great job of trying to, you know, keep up his confidence, but knowing that ultimately things aren't going to end well. And to see, you know, him completely struck by grief by the death of his wife, who's actually played by Emma Corrin, and for those of you who may know her, she recently played Cassandra Nova in Deadpool and Wolverine. But, you know, to see the death of his wife and his children and the way he just kind of breaks completely, Aaron Taylor-Johnson is a great actor, you know, and I want to talk about this quickly because while shooting Nosferatu, he also did Kraven the Hunter, and for those of you who have seen it, you probably know that Kraven the Hunter is not a great film altogether, you know. So, but seeing, you know, Aaron Taylor-Johnson's acting skill and, you know, the gravitas he can bring and his level of expertise and experience and all that, you know, it's a shame he gets stuck with properties like Kraven the Hunter, because I thought his performance was quite good in this. But I guess finally, the final character I wanted to talk about was Ralph Ineson, who plays this doctor, and he plays kind of a key role. You know, he's the one that calls Willem Dafoe's character and, you know, helps him take down the vampire and all that sort of stuff. I thought his performance was pretty good. I enjoyed him a lot, but he didn't really do a lot that made me go, oh wow, okay, he's a big player. Like, he was more just there for support and providing some sort of medical knowledge, essentially. But regardless, I definitely think the characters and the cast were definitely the strongest part of this. While the story was a bit lackluster at times and a bit slow in terms of pacing, I definitely think the performances carried the story, and ultimately it was a very well cast film, with Bill Skarsgård's performance being the outstanding performance. But with that all out of the way, it's time we move on to some final comments / miscellaneous notes about the film. So as I mentioned in the cast and character breakdown, the big thing that I absolutely loved about the film was the prosthetic and makeup work done for Bill Skarsgård to portray Count Orlok. Honestly, it was just absolutely phenomenal. I mean, the fact that from head to toe, they really thought about the design of Orlok, the fact that, you know, he was this man who was just kind of had rotting flesh, you know. He had a mustache for some strange reason. I don't know why, but I noticed he had like a big bushy mustache, but I thought that really worked. But, you know, even towards the end when he's making love to Ellen, you know, and then the sun comes up, you see all the the flesh and like the pores and blood and all that sort of stuff, and yet it was just absolutely phenomenal. And also I have to credit the makeup team for, and Robert Eggers as well, for actually taking the choice of, you know, Count Orlok being able to, I guess, restore his strength, but not actually his appearance. You know, I felt like in previous interpretations, whenever Dracula would, you know, drink a certain amount of blood, he would essentially just rejuvenate himself. It was like nothing had really changed. I mean, if you look at Coppola's version, Gary Oldman, when we're first introduced to him, he's old, he's wrinkly, he looks like he's about to die. But then once he drinks a bit of blood, gets his strength back, he's just like a young, you know, flamboyant gentleman, you know? So I kind of like the fact that they made the choice where blood gives him life, but it doesn't rejuvenate him completely. So I really like that as well. Speaking of Count Orlok drinking blood, bit of a gross subject, but something else I also noticed was they didn't go with the traditional taking blood from the neck. And so, the person I went with when we went to see Nosferatu, he actually made a great point about that. The fact that, you know, he was actually taking blood straight from the heart. And I thought that was a really great choice because it almost kind of hid that Count Orlok was the one behind, you know, drinking the blood from all the, you know, I guess the victims and all that type of stuff, you know, because traditionally vampires, they take it from the neck. And of course you can tell that it's a vampire because, you know, it's the two puncture marks. But the fact that he was taking it from the heart, which is where the source of all the blood, you know, moves through the body and all that sort of stuff, you know, I thought was a really great choice. And there were definitely some gross moments as well. Like at one point, Nosferatu, Count Orlok, he's drinking from Thomas Hutton's heart, and just like, I guess the shot of him like heaving up and down, it's just like drinking from Thomas Hutton, I think was like really, really interesting as well. A bit gross, but really, really interesting as well. So I really like that change in, you know, breaking the stereotype of just, instead of just doing the traditional biting from the neck, you know, they actually went from the heart. So I really like that as well. On top of that as well, I think the cinematography was also really great as well. I forgot who the director of photography was, but there were definitely some great shots here and there that I definitely enjoyed. I also like sort of certain moments, such as like certain just key moments or scenes that I didn't mind, such as when Thomas Hutton, he visits the village prior to going up to Castle Orlok, in a sense, and sort of the people, the gypsies there, they have this tradition to destroy the vampire. I thought like that was a pretty interesting scene as well. There are some things there that I thought was a little like, ooh, that's a bit not necessarily risky, but I'm like, ooh, that's a bit kind of on a weird spectrum, but I thought that was a pretty interesting scene as well. Even the scene where they go to visit Orlok's property in Germany and they think he's in the casket, but it's, you know, the real estate agent. I love that the tension in the scene. I think the tension was really well executed in this film. The fact that, you know, a lot of times, you know, you think there's going to be a jump scare, but it's really just, it's trying to just, the film very much was trying to be a psychological kind of horror film. You know, it was trying to play into, you know, the audience's emotions and, you know, mental state. The fact that, you know, are these characters going to make it out? Are they not? You know, what's the situation with them? You know, so I think there were definitely some great moments here and there. I'd also like to stress as well, first off, I'd recommend going to see the film, but if you're not a big fan of rats, there are a decent amount of rats in this film. There is one scene where, as I mentioned, they go to Orlok's property in Germany, and when they find his casket, the floor is completely filled with rats. Credit to Robert Eggers for being able to get all those rats. I don't know if that was practical or CGI. There are a lot of gross moments though. Like at one point, that real estate agent I mentioned who goes crazy, he's like locked up in an asylum and he's like petting this pigeon, and then next thing you know, he bites the head off the pigeon. But, you know, just stuff like that, I'm just like, you know, it completely works. Like, it's not completely out of place. It just works with the story. So these gross things I absolutely love as well. But another thing I wanted to mention is this film is, although it is rated M by the classification board, I will say this is more for mature audiences. You know, I definitely enjoyed the film, but there are definitely some themes and ideas and even some imagery as well that I think perhaps for younger viewers of my channel as well, I definitely think it's definitely not for you. Give it a couple of years and definitely see it. It's definitely for a more mature audience. But with my final thoughts and miscellaneous notes kind of out of the way, I guess it's time to give the final score of Nosferatu and place it on the MRM scale. So after, you know, evaluating the film, you know, reviewing it, seeing it, all that type of stuff, I came up with the final consensus of where I would like to put the film on the scale, as well as whether you should see the film in cinemas or wait for it on streaming. As for the scale, I definitely say it's definitely better than Gladiator 2 and definitely leaning towards Superman the movie. I will say it kind of falls just a little bit short, sort of almost 3/4 way towards Superman the movie. As I said, there's a lot of great stuff to Nosferatu, and the performances are definitely what carries the film. But as I said, I felt the story was just a little bit lackluster at times, and it is a pretty solid interpretation of Bram Stoker's original novel, but I definitely felt like there could have been a bit more forward momentum in terms of the story. But otherwise, I definitely think it's on the same level as Superman the movie, but maybe just three quarters up towards it, so just above Gladiator 2. As for whether you should see it in cinemas or wait for it on streaming, definitely go see this film in cinemas. It is just a great experience as well. You know, Robert Eggers, I haven't seen a lot of his work, but I know of his style, and it's completely on display, his style here. You know, the minimal color palettes, you know, sort of the morbid acting, the gothic sort of architecture. You know, I really want to check out films like The Northman and the Lighthouse. I have gotten recommendations for those films, so I'm really looking forward to watching those films, perhaps doing a review on them sometime. But definitely go see this film in cinemas. I think it was a great experience for me. You know, it can be a bit loud at times, but I think the noise levels, the times where it's silent, you know, and then the acting, the story, all that sort of stuff, I definitely think elevates the film completely. But regardless, that concludes my review for Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. I do hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope that I've been able to persuade you to see the film, whether you are planning on seeing it or have already seen it and want to see it again. But as always, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and do comment down below if you have seen it. I'd love to have a discussion about it, because I really did enjoy this movie. This has been my favorite movie of 2025 so far. But as always, I hope you enjoyed the video, and keep watching movies.